fortunate to welcome Jeanne and Judi back to the Blair Library. They've been here with us a few times, and they've always done an amazing job. If you've been here with us before, and what you may not know is that they're also active members of the Friends of Wheeling, and over the years they have researched, presented many numerous times, especially for us, and many interesting events and topics about Wheeling's history. They also are co-authors of a book called Walking Through Pleasant Valley, and are also known to be a first-person presentations at the Greenwood and Mount Wood cemeteries, if you've ever gone on the tours. So we are just very thankful and very, very honored to have them come tonight and speak for us. And so please put your hands together and welcome Jeanne and Judi.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank everyone who has agreed to participate, not always willingly, but we thank you. You may notice that you may see some of the same faces more than once. Just use your imagination. They are, if they're supposed to be different people, just pretend they're different people. We're here this evening to reenact one of the most widely publicized trials in Wheeling's history, the trial of Elsie Russell. As you will hear, Elsie was charged in the death of Gladys Lias, one of Wheeling's most notorious underworld bosses, Big Bill Lias. The courtroom is that of Judge John S. Ritz. Several witnesses have been given scripts, and these scripts are based on the actual newspaper coverage from the time. Back in the day, they used to publish just about all of the detail and all the testimony. Now, we have shortened this a bit. In parts, we'll have a reporter to kind of fill in the gaps and so forth, so that we're not here for 3 days. The detailed newspaper coverage wasn't completely accurate, though, so you may remember from the stories that Gladys was shot multiple times and suffered other injuries as well, but the newspaper the next morning said she died of suicide. I will play the part of the prosecuting attorney, T.H. Duval, and Judi Hendrickson will portray the defense attorney, Austin D. Wood. 12 people will serve as the jury. Thank you very much, jury. And of course, back in the day, it was all men on the jury. And it's been pointed out that most are not, but couldn't get a lot of the men in the audience to participate, but that's all right. After we've heard their verdict this evening, we'll tell the rest of the story and what the verdict was back in the day. Now, we have an added visitor here this evening. Mr. Visitor, would you come in? This might add a little bit of pressure onto the jury's decision.
Yes, Mr. Lias, you are. Yes, Mr. Lias. Please stop.
I must say I'm happy to have this being held in the All-American town, because the results of the last trial, I didn't like. So, mine is
Oh, not at all. Whatever you would like, Mr. Lias.
Yes. Please have a seat beside the jury, Mr. Lias. No influence, please, Mr. Lias.
Thank you. All right, so sit back and imagine yourselves in the gallery of the courtroom as the trial begins.
Oh yay, oh yay. The court of Judge John S. Ritz will now come to order. All rise.
We are here in late June 1934 in the immediate courtroom of Judge.
One second, sir.
Court is now in session. You may be seated. All witnesses have been sworn. Prosecution may begin.
Please, Your Honor. One of the biggest crowds in the history of court annals here is expected as Mrs. Elsie Russell of 2342 Chaplain Street goes on trial for the murder and the death of Mrs. Gladys Lias, shot to death in the Russell apartment the night of April 26, 1934. The victim was the wife of William Bill Lias, Wheeling Numbers King, and the accused was the wife of Mike Russell, Lias' cousin and business partner. After the shooting, Mrs. Russell told authorities that Mrs. Lias ended her own life in spite of her own efforts to wrest the revolver from her. A regular grand jury refused to indict Mrs. Russell, but a true bill was secured from a special grand jury by Judge John S. Ritz.
Thank you. The state first calls Funeral Director Harry Schmeichel to the stand. Mr. Schmeichel, would you come and take your seat, please?
I know the judge.
Mr. Schmeichel, you went to the Russell apartment on the morning of April 27, 1934. Please tell the court what you found there.
I found the body of Gladys Lias lying on a bed covered with a sheet. I secured the body.
Thank you. No further questions?
No questions.
The state, thank you, sir. The state now calls Dr. W.G. Bowler. Dr. Bowler, you reside on the first floor of 2342 Chaplain Street, below the Russell apartment. Please tell the court what you witnessed the night of the shooting.
I was in my office in the rear of my apartment reading. I did not hear anyone enter the building, but at about 10:30 at night, I heard a noise that sounded like gun explosions. There were 3 shots in quick succession, and 2 more followed after a brief pause. Then I heard Elsie Russell running towards the steps. She's a heavy walker, and I could tell that it was she who was running. She ran up to my door and screamed. Now what has happened? She killed herself, and I tried so hard to prevent her.
And then what happened?
She was very nervous and was crying. I asked her who had been killed, and she told me it was Gladys Lias. I asked her if she wanted me to get to the police, but she said, no, get Dr. McClung. I tried to find Dr. McClung, but couldn't reach him, so I found Dr. Klug, who lives up the street, and then went back to the Russell's apartment, and I saw Mike Russell stepping out of an automobile.
What did you see when you went into the Russell apartment?
I went into the bedroom, and after walking around the bed, I saw a body lying on the floor. The head was at the foot of the bed. The body was laying straight. The hands were at the sides. Mrs. Russell came upstairs after me, but she went back downstairs when Mr. Lias and some other people came.
Did Mr. Lias say anything to Mrs. Russell?
Yes, he accused her in an indirect way, saying, it's all your fault. Mrs. Russell then said, I couldn't help it. It was not my fault. I didn't do it because I never handled a gun before. I never shot a gun.
And what did you do next?
I picked up the gun and put it in my coat pocket, fearing that there might be another shooting. Then I tried to get into my own apartment, but my niece had locked the door. When I asked her why she had done that, she said that Mrs. Russell had asked her to, saying that she was afraid of Mr. Lias. Then I gave Mrs. Russell some medicine to settle her nerve.
Thank you. The prosecution has no more questions.
Dr. Bowler, did you have a conversation with Mrs. Russell earlier that evening?
Yes, she had come to my apartment around 9 o'clock. She said that she just received a phone call, was going to have company, but that she wanted a treatment and would have it later that night.
Did you ever treat Mrs. Russell?
Yes, I treated her many times for sinus trouble.
And did you know Mrs. Lias?
I had never seen Mrs. Lias until I saw her body beside the bed.
Do you know whether Mrs. Lias, until I saw her body? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know whether Mrs. Lias ever came to the door and created a disturbance?
Objection. The witness has already testified that he did not know Mrs. Lias.
Overruled. You may answer the question.
The first summer that the Russells lived here, and while Mr. Lias was in Atlanta, somebody came to the door and started knocking it, kicking it, and demanding to be permitted to enter. Mrs. Russell at first told me it was a lady from out the pike, but later she admitted that it was Mrs. Lias.
I object. This is hearsay.
Sustained. The jury will disregard the last question and answer.
How long was it between the first shot and when Mrs. Russell appeared at your door?
It was less than a minute in which the shots were fired. Then Mrs. Russell was at my door right away, frantic with terror. She asked me to go upstairs with her as a witness.
Please comment on Mrs. Russell's reputation as a peaceful and law-abiding citizen.
She would have the highest rating.
Thank you. I have no more questions of this witness.
Dr. Bowler, would it have been possible for any other person to have left the Russell apartment without your hearing them?
No.
Thank you. No more questions. The prosecution now calls Ms. Helen Mayo. Ms. Mayo, you're the niece of Dr. Bowler, who just testified, and you were in his apartment at the time of the shooting. Please tell us what you witnessed.
I was reading when I heard the shots and heard a commotion upstairs. Elsie Russell came to our door and cried, "She shot herself! She shot herself!" Then she said that she had struck Mrs. Lias in the face with the gun while she was attempting to take it away from her.
Did you ask her about calling the police?
Yes, but Mrs. Russell said, "No, don't get the police."
Did she say anything else to you a bit later?
Yes, she said, hide me. I'm afraid that Bill is going to kill me."
No more questions. Your witness.
What was the condition of Mrs. Russell when she came to the door the first time?
She was highly excited.
Thank you.
I have no more questions.
The prosecution now calls Patrolman Harry McLaughlin to the stand. Officer McLaughlin, you were the first police officer on the scene. Please describe what you found.
I went to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Russell, along with Dr. Will Cruz, the Ohio County coroner. Mrs. Russell was hysterical and told me that Mr. Elias had grabbed a gun, and Mrs. Russell said she thought Mrs. Lias was going to commit suicide.
Was the furniture in the room disarranged?
No.
Thank you, Officer McLaughlin.
The defense has no questions of this witness.
Prosecution now calls Dr. Will Cruz to the stand. Dr. Cruz, please describe what you observed on the night of the death of Mrs. Lias.
Upon arriving at the scene, I spoke with Mrs. Russell. She told me that she and Mrs. Lias had been seated on the bed and had been talking about shows and had not been arguing. She said that Mrs. Lias had mentioned her fear of undergoing an operation for the removal of gallstones, and then suddenly grabbed a gun from the nearby stand. Mrs. Russell said that she thought that Mrs. Lias was going to commit suicide. She said she grabbed the gun and didn't remember what happened after that.
Please describe the bullet wounds.
There were wounds to the victim's chest and leg.
I now enter several items into evidence.
I have a blood-stained dress.
Several shell casings. Not a good she was holding it.
I know, I'm useless, aren't I? I don't want her to win.
One hose with bullet wound. And the revolver that was found at the scene.
No questions.
The prosecution now calls motorcycle officer Albert Megley. Officer Megley, you were also at the scene shortly after the shooting. Please describe what you saw.
I observed a bullet mark on a cupboard latch in the bedroom, but otherwise didn't see any of the furniture that had been disturbed. I also found a blackjack in a dressing drawer table.
I object. The finding of the blackjack is irrelevant, whatever.
Sustained. The jury will disregard any mention of the word blackjack.
And the defense has no more questions, and so I thank you, sir. The prosecution now calls Detective Hamilton Ritz. Detective Ritz, will you please describe your involvement?
I secured the revolver that had been used in the shooting. It had only a few drops of blood on the muzzle, but none on the handle. Mrs. Liza's hands and arms were bloody.
No questions.
Thank you. The prosecution now calls City Detective Charles Flanagan to the stand. Detective Flanagan, you spoke to Mrs. Russell on the night of the shooting. Please tell the jury what she said to you.
Mrs. Russell said that Mrs. Lias shot herself.
Thank you. No more questions.
Detective Flanagan, can you tell us what you know of Mrs. Russell's reputation?
Objection. The witness would have no knowledge of her reputation.
Sustained.
Thank you, sir. The prosecution now calls Dr. J.R. McClung, the coroner. Dr. McClung, you conducted the post-mortem of the deceased. Please describe your findings.
Doctors A.L. Shin and G.E. Strobel assisted in the post-mortem. We found one bullet had passed through her heart, another through the left lung, one through the left shoulder, one through the left knee. There were also deep lacerations on the forehead and left temple, and the nose had been badly broken. The head and nose wounds were likely received prior to the shots through the chest.
Now, Mrs. Russell initially stated that Mrs. Lias attempted suicide, and in fact, a headline in the Wheeling newspaper the following day actually stated that she had committed suicide. In your expert opinion, could the shots you described have been fired by Mrs. Lias herself?
It would be highly improbable that Mrs. Lias could have fired the shots due to the position of the wounds and the size of the revolver used.
Thank you. I have no more questions of this witness.
Dr. McClung, you served as Mrs. Lias's doctor prior to her death. Please describe your experience with her as a patient.
Mrs. Lias was given to fits of temper. She often became very angry when I was unable to come to her home as soon as she called.
Did she ever become violent?
I never saw her become violent or in an attack of violence.
I have several other questions of Dr. McClung. Sir, you were called to treat Mrs. Russell the day following the shooting. Please describe the reason for this.
I was called to the home of Nick Caravasius the following day. There, I found Mrs. Russell in a very agitated state, acting more like a maniac. She was pulling her hair, slapping her face. She was highly nervous, and I had her taken to a hospital. I was not sure whether it was a true nervous condition or if it was being exaggerated. I examined her the next day and came to the conclusion that it was a true condition. She continued in this state for 10 days to 2 weeks. I made a complete physical examination on April 28th, 2 days after the shooting. I found the left side of her face and lips swollen, several bruises on the legs and left hip, and numerous tender spots about her body. During this period, at the slightest noise, she would jump almost out of bed and demanded to know every person who entered her room.
What would have caused the bruises that you found?
Well, the injuries were likely from blows.
If a person was frantic with fear, would you say they would be responsible for anything they said?
Well, from the mental state in which she was, she may have made any kind of statement, not realizing what she was doing. It may or may not have been a true statement.
Thank you, I have no more questions.
Dr. McClung, at what period are you basing your opinion of her mental state?
On the day following the shooting, no name was mentioned.
Suppose Mrs. Russell had sat in police headquarters following the shooting and was not acting like a maniac, but seated peacefully and answered questions. What would you say as to her responsibility as to make statements then?
I was basing my opinion on her condition the day after the shooting.
What was she afraid of while she was in the hospital?
No specific things. She mentioned nobody.
Thank you. No more questions. The state now calls Miss Anna O'Farrell to the stand. Miss O'Farrell, you were employed as a maid by the victim, Mrs. Lias. Please describe what you observed the evening of the shooting.
Mrs. Lias left her home shortly after 9 o'clock. She was in a good humor, although she admitted that Mr. Lias had forbidden her to go to the Russell home. She asked me not to tell her husband that she was going to visit Mrs. Russell.
Please tell the court of an earlier conversation you had with Mrs. Russell.
Mrs. Russell came to the Lias house while Mrs. Russell came to the Lias house while Mrs. Lias was in Iowa. She asked me to tell Mr. Lias that his wife was using drugs.
And what would you say about that?
The only time I saw Mrs. Lias undergoing treatment of that kind was when a narcotic was administered by Dr. McClung, her physician.
Then what did Mrs. Russell say?
She said that she would knock the hell out of Mrs. Lias the next time she appeared at the Russell home.
When Mr. Lias was serving time in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for conspiring to violate the national prohibition laws, you overheard a telephone conversation between Mrs. Lias and Mrs. Russell. Please tell the court what you heard.
Mrs. Lias was upset because she heard that Theodore Russell, her husband's cousin, boasted that he could have Mrs. Lias's home or jewels at any time. That was while Theodore had power of attorney for Bill Lias while he was in the pen. Mrs. Lias accused Mrs. Russell of spreading that story.
Please tell the court about a conversation about the Lias' adopted son.
Mrs. Russell asked me who she should consult in order to have the Lias' adopted son taken from the couple.
Thank you. Your witness?
No questions.
Thank you. The state now calls Mrs. L.A. Bradley to the stand. Mrs. Bradley, you are the sister-in-law of Mrs. Lias's. You are married to her brother, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Mrs. Lias visited you earlier in the evening of the shooting. Please tell us what occurred at that time.
Gladys came to my home about 9:30 that evening. She did not seem excited and told me about plans she had made to take my children to the circus and the following day. She then left saying she was going to visit Elsie Russell.
Some people have suggested that Mrs. Lias was jealous of Mrs. Russell. Can you comment on that?
She didn't seem jealous to me. In fact, I recall one time when Gladys urged Mike Russell to buy some new evening gown for Elsie.
Thank you. Your witness?
When Mrs. Lias left your home on the night of the shooting, what did she say about her proposed visit with Mrs. Russell?
Well, she did say she was going to make Elsie stick to her story one way or the other. That was the story about Theodore saying he could take her home and jewels and whether or not she had been spreading that story.
Redirect, Your Honor. Mrs. Bradley, what do you know of the physical strength of the victim?
She wasn't at all strong. I had an argument with Gladys about 2 years ago and no problem pushing her on the bed and holding her there. And that was even before she became afflicted with gallbladder trouble.
Thank you, your witness.
Did you call the police or other aid when you had that confrontation with Mrs. Lias?
No.
The defense recalls Dr. McClung, Dr. McClung, is it a fact that a person in Mrs. Lias's condition or any other person in an emergency such as this would display superhuman strength?
I object to this question. This calls for speculation.
Overruled. The witness may answer the question.
Any individual showing a fit of temper would show superhuman strength. Person size has nothing to do with strength.
At such a time, would a person feel much pain, although shot in the shoulder?
During anger, a person might tend to be ignorant of the pain, but I believe the left arm in this case could not be used to any great extent.
Dr. McClung, could superhuman strength also have been brought about by fear?
Yes, I would say so.
Thank you. I have no more questions of this witness.
Thank you. The defense calls Mrs. Mary K. Sonnenfeld. Mrs. Sonnenfeld, you live next door to the Liases. Please tell us your opinion of Mrs. Lias's character.
Gladys always had a good reputation. She was a good neighbor and a quiet woman.
You had a conversation with the defendant, Mrs. Russell, at one time. What did she say to you?
Mrs. Russell asked me to tell Bill Lias that Gladys was a dope fiend, but I refused. My daughter came to back me up.
Thank you. No more questions. The defense now calls Miss Virginia Holland to the stand. Miss Holland, you are employed in the Russell home. Please tell the court what you know about the relationship between the two women.
I knew there was trouble between the two women, but I didn't know what it was about.
Was there a specific instance that occurred at a card party?
Yes. Mrs. Russell and Mrs. Lias were among a party playing cards. Mrs. Russell said that she didn't want to play any longer and was going home. Mrs. Lias became angry and threw her cards at Mrs. Russell.
Would you say that Mrs. Lias had a bad temper?
I couldn't say. I didn't know her that well.
Miss Holland, did you ever hear any threats between the two women?
No.
Was the temper shown by Mrs. Lias at the card party out of the ordinary for women while playing cards?
No, sir.
Thank you. That is all. The defense now calls Mrs. Emma Brennan. Mrs. Brennan, you are a neighbor of Mrs. Russell. Please describe your relationship.
Sorry.
I went to Wheeling Park with Mrs. Russell last summer because she was alone, and I thought she might be lonesome.
And what happened there?
We were at the park, and Mrs. Lias came toward Mrs. Russell. Mrs. Russell immediately left me, and Mrs. Lias followed her, talking very excited for several minutes. Mrs. Russell returned in a short time, and she was a changed woman. She said to me, "My evening is spoiled. I will have to go home." I felt sorry for her and went home with her.
Do you know what the women were talking about?
No.
Thank you. No more questions. The defense now calls Mrs. Jessie McFreely to the stand. Mrs. McFreely, Please describe the reputation of Mrs. Russell.
She is a peaceful, law-abiding citizen of the highest standing.
Thank you.
The defense called 15 more character witnesses. All had the same opinion of Mrs. Russell, that she was peaceful, law-abiding, and had the highest standing in the community. The courtroom has been filled to capacity each day of the trial despite the intensity. Women have made up the greater part of the audience, and almost everyone has had a cardboard fan in an effort to keep themselves cool. Judge Ritz threatened a number of times to clear the room unless the crowd remained quiet. Mrs. Russell, who was outwardly calm yesterday, seemed slightly nervous today. She continued to move her hands about but paid strict attention to the questioning of all witnesses, talking with her counsel. She was accompanied by Mrs. Lena Rivers Solomon, a nurse, after she was forced to go back to the jail and take medicine. We are now in the final day of the trial.
The defense now calls the defendant, Mrs. Elsie Russell, to the stand. Mrs. Russell, please tell us of your background.
I was born and raised in Canada, and next September I'll be 35. And I have been married to Mike Russell for 16 years now. In our early years of marriage, we operated a cigar stand up in Detroit. It wasn't successful, so we moved to Wheeling, where my husband's cousin, Bill Lias over there, lived. And I have never been in any trouble here.
Did you hate Mrs. Lias? I'm sorry. Please tell us of your relationship with Mrs. Lias. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself.
Gladys and I had our ups and downs, and one time she offered me a glass of beer, and when I refused it, she threw it at me. Then, another time she asked me for a cigarette, and when I said I didn't have any, she threw the ashtray at me and saying, "If you don't have any cigarettes, then you don't need an ashtray either." Gladys often threatened she's going to get me. I was kind of afraid of her, and I recall one time when Gladys came to our house at 3 o'clock in the morning, and she created quite a disturbance when our door was locked, of course. She raised an awful rumpus, and I let her in so she wouldn't wake the neighbors, and when she got in, she said she wanted a drink, and I told her that we didn't have anything, but I'd send out to get some. Well, instead of doing that, I called her brother, who came and got her and took her home that night. Last November the 22nd, our 15th wedding anniversary, Gladys got drunk at our party at our apartment and began to break up our furniture. On that occasion, her husband, Bill, had to take Gladys home. Thank goodness.
Now I'll ask you this question again. Did you hate Mrs. Lias?
Did I hate Mrs. Lias? No. I just felt sorry for her because sometimes she just wasn't right in the head. I was kind of afraid of Gladys.
Then why did you go around with her?
Well, Bill Lias compelled me to go with her. You know, Mr. Lias and my husband are cousins, and they were in business together. Mr. Lias told me if I didn't go with his wife, that he would fire my husband.
Mrs. Russell, please describe in your own words the events of April the 26th.
Gladys called me on the phone at about 8:30 that evening. She asked me about the story about the Theodore Russell saying that he could take our house and my jewels when Bill was in the pen. I told her I had nothing to do with that. She seemed angry and said she was coming over to our apartment. And when she got there, I asked her what was wrong, and she didn't answer me, but just brushed by me and went upstairs. I never saw her look so mad in my whole life.
And then what happened?
She went into my bedroom and sat on the dressing table. I sat on the bed facing her, and then she came over and sat at the head of my bed and started talking about her relatives. I tried to change the subject by talking about a woman that had just died and about the movies, but she didn't pay any attention to me and kept talking about her relatives. She was highly nervous and started to cry. Then she suddenly grabbed my husband's gun, which was in the drawer of a small stand at the head of the bed. I thought she was going to commit suicide, and I grabbed for her saying, "No, not in my house." I had a hold of her, and she said to me, "Let go of me." And I knew she was going to try to kill me. We got to the foot of the bed, and a shot was fired. We fired across the room like a football, and then we both fell just as another shot was fired. We both got up, and she kicked me, and I ran to the corner of the room, and she came after me. Her eyes were like glass, and I never saw the likes of them. Her face, I had never seen anything like it.
Did you shoot Mrs. Lias?
Did I shoot Mrs. Lias? Well, I don't remember firing any shots. And I don't remember running to my neighbor's apartment. My mind is blank, and as to what I did after the shooting, I don't know.
Did you want to kill Mrs. Lias?
I didn't hate her. I kind of felt sorry for her. That woman was not right.
Thank you. I have no more questions.
Mrs. Russell, is it true that Mrs. Lias gave you a living room suit, claiming that she had paid $75 for it without telling her husband?
No, that's not true.
Had Mrs. Lias given you the use of her home?
No.
After the shooting, you claimed that Mrs. Lias was trying to commit suicide. Is that correct?
I said, I don't remember what I said.
No further questions. Thank you, Mrs. Russell.
The defense calls Dr. A.L. Osterman. Dr. Osterman, you are a neurologist, and you examined Mrs. Russell 15 days after the shooting. Please describe her condition at that time.
Mrs. Russell had suffered a nervous collapse after the shooting and was admitted to the hospital. 15 days later, I found her to still be in an extremely nervous state. In my opinion, she was not responsible for anything she did after the shooting.
Mrs. Russell had stated that she doesn't recall the details of the night of the shooting. Can you comment on that?
In my opinion, it would be natural for Mrs. Russell not to recall what had happened.
Thank you, Dr. Osterman. With the court's permission, I would now like to read a disposition taken of Mrs. Catherine Caravasius, a sister-in-law of Mrs. Lias, who is now confined to a sanitarium in Washington, Pennsylvania, and is unable to testify in person.
That permission will be granted.
Thank you. Mrs. Caravasius stated the following in a sworn deposition. Gladys called me the night of the shooting and told me that she was going to fix the feud, referring to the Theodore Russell claim that he could take her home and Jules. I asked her to be quiet, but she said, "No, I can't stand it any longer." I think Gladys was jealous of Elsie. When Gladys had anything, she didn't want Elsie to have the same thing. Your Honor, before the defense rests, I would like to make a motion that the charge of first-degree murder be removed as an option, since the state has failed to show any evidence that the shooting was premeditated.
Motion is sustained.
I now make a motion that the court direct a verdict of not guilty.
That motion is overruled. We will now hear closing arguments. Mr. Duvall?
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state has shown that Mrs. Russell had circulated certain stories that were detrimental to Mrs. Lias's character. Mrs. Russell admitted that she was afraid of Mrs. Lias, yet she permitted her to enter her home the night of the shooting and allowed her to go into a room where the handle of a gun was sticking out of a drawer. It is clear that Mrs. Russell shot and killed Mrs. Lias. Only 2 women were alone in that apartment that night. One came out and the other lay dead. And you heard experts testify that it would have been nearly impossible for Mrs. Lias to have fired the shots that caused her death. I urge you to bring back a verdict of guilty.
Mrs. Russell, would you sit here for me, please? Please face the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask for fair treatment of this defendant. You must consider the defendant as you would any other woman, and consider her in the light of the element in which she was found. Mrs. Russell is a good woman, and she has never before been in any kind of trouble. Mrs. Lias had a very violent temper, and many times had thrown things at Mrs. Russell. Mrs. Russell never reciprocated. It is obvious that Mrs. Lias was attempting to shoot the defendant. The women wrestled, as it is obvious, and is evidenced by the bruises and the other injuries that they both received. The revolver exploded, and the bullet hit Mrs. Lias in the leg. The revolver again went off, and this time it hit her in the shoulder. Mrs. Russell at that point backed into a corner of the room. Mrs. Lias started toward her, and it was then that the defendant fired the bullet that pierced Mrs. Lias's heart. And she only fired after she believed that she was going to be killed. I ask that you find Mrs. Elsie Russell not guilty.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution has not proved premeditation in this shooting, so you are not to consider a verdict of first-degree murder. You can bring in one of 4 possible verdicts: second-degree murder, carrying a penalty of 5 to 18 years in the penitentiary; voluntary manslaughter, punishable by a sentence of 1 to 5 years; involuntary manslaughter, carrying a jail term of up to 1 year, or you may return a finding of not guilty.
The storm has raged outside during the closing arguments. Lightning has flashed at the windows, thunder booming overhead. Several times the lights dimmed but did not die out entirely. It is late in the evening. The jury is now retiring to their deliberations.
While the jury deliberates, and we do have a jury foreman here, Mr. Lias, would you perhaps step away from the jury so that they wouldn't be influenced in any way? And perhaps you would like to say a few words to the folks in the gallery.
I don't need that.
Before I share some of my thoughts about this, I
I first want to say that it's been many years since I've seen such a classy collection of headwear.
Now they're telling me I need a microphone.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, I was scanning the crowd while I was listening to all this stuff. And I didn't see none of my old pals in this group. And I'm going to bet that most of you don't remember me when I was alive. But you probably all heard some old stories about me. Maybe some of them stories is true. Like I told Life magazine one time, I ain't been no angel. Back in the day, when I was running things across the river, Wheeling was known as a wide open town. You could find any variety of entertainment that you could possibly imagine. And I know that because I provided a lot of that entertainment.
I drank it, I'm sorry.
And entertainment's all about taking care of the customer. And we take real good care of the customer over there. People were free to walk the streets day and night. Never a problem. And you know, the city of Wheeling always treated us great. We never ever had one issue with the city of Wheeling. Now, the county folks, state folks, federal folks, they all saw things a little differently. But the city of Wheeling was really great for us. And I say us for a reason. As you've heard some of this testimony about Mrs. Russell, Mike Russell, he moved from Detroit down to Wheeling to help me. And he was real good at convincing local barkeepers to buy their booze from us. And he kept the numbers racket running smoothly too. But after all this stuff went on with his wife, I also found out that he wasn't no angel either. Me and him parted company when I found out he was stealing more than his share of the gambling money while I was away in prison for a while. And when we split up, he moved across the river. And I'm not sure if he was in Bel Air or not, but he was over in this area. And you know, a couple funny things about that. You know, I had more than one big trial, as you might imagine, on alleged tax evasion or conspiracy charges. And I beat the first rap in 1935. And 2 years later, a second trial took a funny turn. When Mike Russell, he was scheduled to testify against me. Well, a couple days before that trial, Mike was found shot to death on 15th Street. Some folks thought I might have had something to do with that, but there was never any evidence for that. When we split up, like I said, he moved across the river. And the word on the street I heard was that he was trying to muscle in on the local hoodlums action over here. So this whole family, this Russell family, they all got a bunch of issues. A lot of the stuff I heard tonight, I just can't believe. And I'm hoping that the jury comes back and gives me the justice for my wife Gladys. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lias. I believe the jury has made a decision, but before we hear that, let's just take an informal poll of the people in the gallery. You will recall that the judge gave you 4 options. They were second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, or not guilty. So if we could just have a show of hands, how many would have voted for second-degree murder? How many would have said voluntary manslaughter? involuntary manslaughter, and not guilty.
It looks like involuntary manslaughter. The decision of the audience was involuntary manslaughter, by the way, 5 count.
The foreman has given me this slip of paper that says voluntary manslaughter.
Thank you. Now, before you leave, let's hear the rest of the story and then a couple other details at the end.
An estimated 2,800 people paid their respects at the funeral home for where Gladys Lias laid in repose. Possibly the largest funeral in the city's history. Some $3,000 worth of wreaths and similar remembrances surrounded the bier, the equivalent of nearly $56,000 today. So many arrangements that the city's flower shops was temporarily exhausted. The press reported that the most outstanding floral tribute, a stand of flowers 5 feet high, topped off by a white dove, came from Mike Russell. Following the funeral, mourners and curiosity seekers crowded the 200 cars to Greenwood Cemetery. Gladys's remains were eventually removed in 1964 and taken to a cemetery in Iowa. The original jury acquitted Elsie Russell after deliberating an hour and 45 minutes. The crowded, hot courtroom was intensely quiet as the jury filed in at 11:35 p.m. on June the 29th, 1934. But a demonstration broke loose when the acquittal verdict was read. Then Judge Ritz was forced to wield his gavel vigorously and asked sheriffs to quiet the throng before order was restored. When Mrs. Russell became fully aware of the fact that she was freed, she walked over to the jury and clasped each man by the hand, thanking him, or woman. Then she was hurried over to the jail residence where she was greeted by her husband. The partnership between Mike Russell and Bill Lias ended after the death of Gladys. In 1936, Russell started a numbers business in competition with Lias, as Mr. Lias had said. During this time, federal prosecutors were now launching a new case, charging, among others, Russell with conspiracy to evade income tax on their numbers profits. Russell began telling people that he would spill all he knew about Lias and others once the trial began. Lias sent him a threatening letter. Then, at about 2 a.m. on the 25th, Mike Russell stopped at a restaurant at 16th Street and Market Street. He left the place by himself. At 3:15, he drove past and waved at a willing policeman. At 3:40, he parked in front of 142.5 15th Street, where he and his wife had an apartment overlooking the street. Elsie Russell reported that she heard rapid gunfire and looked out to see a short, stocky man still firing a pistol at her husband, who lay on the sidewalk. The police arrived and found Russell dead. He had been shot with a .38 caliber pistol. The coroner surmised that the first 2 shots were to the head, which killed Russell immediately. The gunman then fired the others while standing directly over him. The bullets had steel points. One of Russell's arms was almost detached from the shoulder. Even though many leads were followed on the case and Elsie was able to make a vague description of the assailant, no one was ever charged with the murder. No further trace of Elsie was found in future newspaper articles or other reports.
Thank you. Just a couple other things. We would definitely like to thank Big Bill Lias, who is portrayed by Dave Clutter. Dave, would you stand? Elsie Russell.
to make this clear to everyone. And I had to talk to a gentleman and his wife, I'm assuming it was his wife, out front. And now, Ms. Finstein, I must remind you and everyone here that nobody ever called me Big Bill to my face.
Thank you. In real life, Dave's wife, Sandra, portrayed Elsie Russell this evening. And again, I'd like to thank the members of the jury and our witnesses. And I will say one other thing, and that is that a friend of mine is a son of one of Bill Lias's attorneys in real life. And somehow the actual gun that was used in the killing was left to my friend. And this is it, if you'd like to come up and see it before you leave. So thanks for your attention. Have a good evening.
You take questions? Do you take questions?
Oh, yes, questions. We have run the hour. Thank you.
I have one.
Yes, Judge.
Was there was an Osterman that was a doctor?
Yes.
Was that a relative of the Dr. Osterman that was murdered in his office in Wheeling?
Oh, I can't answer that, but that's something to look up. Thank you.